Now that we have propositions in view, I want to frame Frege's arguments about sense and reference in terms of our questions about propositions. Although introducing propositions involves some fairly complicated machinery, not easy to understand what a proposition is, once we've got that machinery in place, it's much easier to understand what Frege was up to. So here's where we are, if you remember. We want to know what should we use to distinguish the contents of mental states. This is a bit like asking, what should we use to distinguish the temperatures of things or the weights of things? You're cooking some soup and you might give me the temperature of the thing by using a system of numbers. So you could tell me it's 32 degrees centigrade, Steve. Or we could use an informal system like, well, Steve, it's a bit warm, but it's not really piping hot yet. We've got various ways of distinguishing the temperatures of things, and likewise, we should have various ways of distinguishing the contents of mental states. But what we've seen so far is that although propositions are going to be the things that we'd use to distinguish the contents of mental states, if we try to do that using Lewisian propositions, that's to say sets of possible worlds, we're not going to be able to make all the distinctions that we really need to make, because it seems like you could have two separate thoughts which are logically equivalent, true in all of the same possible worlds, but yet distinct. But there's no distinct Lewisian propositions to keep track of those. So it looks like what we might need is something like a Russellian proposition. But here's the thing. Frege's argument, the main argument on sense and reference, is in effect the argument that we can't use Russellian propositions to distinguish the contents of mental states. Here's how the argument goes. We notice that the Russellian proposition, which we might express by saying Charlie is a secret agent, consists of a tuple. A tuple, you remember, is essentially a fancy set containing the property of being a secret agent and Charlie herself. Likewise, the Russellian proposition that we might express by saying that Samantha is a secret agent is a tuple consisting of that property and Samantha herself. But here's the thing. Samantha and Charlie are one and the same. Charlie is Samantha. That tells us, of course, that the propositions are also one and the same. A set is individuated by its members. The set containing Samantha is the same thing as the set containing Charlie because Samantha and Charlie are the same. Similarly, the proposition about Charlie being a secret agent just is the Russellian proposition about Samantha being a secret agent because those are just essentially sets. They're sets with the same members, so they're sets of the same thing. Very simple. But now you can see what the problem is. According to Russell, what goes into the proposition is the thing itself, Charlie herself. And now, if we want to distinguish your thought that you express by saying Charlie is a secret agent from the thought that you express by saying Samantha is a secret agent, we can't use the Russellian propositions. We'd have to use the same proposition twice, and so we wouldn't be able to distinguish those thoughts by content at all, even though we should. That's why Frege says that what goes into the proposition is not the thing itself, not Charlie, but some sense, some mode of presentation of Charlie, some way of thinking about Charlie, as Frege says. I think that's just terminology. So the thought here is very simple. It looks like we can't use Russellian propositions to distinguish the contents of mental states if we want to make all of the distinctions in content that we need to make in order to understand the points of view of people who are watching the film The Long Kiss Goodnight, or indeed to understand the points of view of the protagonists involved in that film. We have to suppose that we are using something other than Russellian propositions to distinguish the contents of their mental states. The proposal then, here, is that we can't use the Russellian propositions, but we might be able to use the Fregean propositions, where a Fregean proposition is just like a Russellian proposition, has a similar structure, except for that what you put in is not the objects themselves, but rather the senses, the corresponding senses. So you don't put Charlie in there, you put a way of thinking about Charlie, a sense concerning Charlie, into the proposition. And that allows you to have distinct propositions corresponding to the thought that Charlie is a secret agent and Samantha is a secret agent. Distinct senses, distinct propositions. What a brilliant idea. Well done, Frege. So this was my pitch to you. We did quite a bit of work to introduce the notion of proposition, Not an easy thing to get your head around. But once we've done that work, we've got a simpler and clearer way of putting Frege's argument about sense and reference, and we can see that the argument is clearly correct, or at least there's a lot to be said in favour of it. Having got this far, I want to take a moment now just to look at another argument that Frege gives, an independent argument. So here's another of Frege's arguments for distinguishing sense and reference. Frege says, now that part of the thought which corresponds to the name Charlie cannot be Charlie herself. We're still with the long kiss goodnight here. For each individual piece which is part of Charlie would then also be part of the thought that Charlie is a secret agent. Well, that's true enough. But, says Frege, it seems absurd that the pieces of Charlie, even pieces of which I had no knowledge, should be parts of my thought. So here is an attempt by Frege to argue that what we put into the thought can't be Charlie herself, but must be something else, and therefore to reach the conclusion that the thing we put into the thought is the sense, the way of thinking about Charlie. Now, how convincing should we find this argument? Is this a plausible argument? I don't think it is. I think when Frege is talking here about thoughts, he's not actually talking about mental states. After all, mental state's something subjective. That's to say, it has a subject. I'm the subject of my mental states, you're the subject of your mental states. My mental states are different from your mental states. What Frege's after here, when he's talking about thought, though, is clear from the context. He's after something which you could think about, but which I could think about. So he must be really thinking about propositions. I think we make much more sense of what Frege is saying if we change thought to proposition. But if that's right, then the whole thing falls apart. The reason it falls apart is very simple. There's no problem at all with taking an object like Charlie and putting her in a set. There could be a set of me, a set of you, a set containing you and I, a set containing you, me and Charlie. No problem at all. So having a set of concrete objects, not a problem. Sets are abstract objects. The set itself will be abstract, but there's no problem with the idea that it can contain members which are concrete. But a Russellian proposition is just a set. So there's no problem, of course, none at all, with the idea that Charlie could be part of a Russellian proposition. So it seems to me that this second independent argument for distinguishing sense from reference is not going anywhere. This, on Frege's part, is an entirely failed argument, and we should just give up on that argument altogether. Why do I mention this? Well, partly because it's important to look at the different arguments that Frege makes from distinguishing sense and reference. It's usually thought, I think, that there are three. I could be wrong about that. I think there are three. We've looked at two so far. So first of all, I want to distinguish them. And secondly, now that we've got the propositions in view, it seems so easy to go through Frege's arguments and to understand them and make sense of them. So Frege's argument, I think, no, we shouldn't accept this argument. Where are we? Let me give you a quick summary so far. We're asking what distinguishes the contents of mental states. We've seen that Frege's argument about sense and reference is in effect an argument against using Russellian propositions to distinguish the contents of mental states. What Frege's argument about sense and reference shows us is this. If we want to understand the points of view of the protagonists in the film, The Long Kiss Goodnight, or indeed the viewers of that film, then we can't use Russellian propositions to make all of the distinctions among the contents of thoughts that we need to make. So we need some other kind of proposition, not Lewisian, not Russellian. Enter the Fregean proposition. The Fregean proposition is structured just like the Russellian proposition, but instead of putting objects in there, we put senses in there. Now what we want to know is whether, using Fregean propositions, we can distinguish the contents of mental states. If we can, then we will have understood something quite formal about how to characterize points of view.